Well, hello everyone. Once again, this is Pastor James with you. This is Christian Classics That You May Not Know. This is our current online video discipleship series, and glad to have you along for the ride again today. So, this particular video is going to be about a Christian classic by Reinhold Niebuhr called Moral Man and Immoral Society. So, that name may sound familiar to you if you've been following along in this video series, because the last video we did was a video on a book from Reinhold Niebuhr's brother. His brother was named Richard Niebuhr, and last week, or last time in our last video, we talked about the book Christ and Culture by Richard Niebuhr. So Richard Niebuhr had a brother whose name was Reinhold, and these were two theological giants. And Reinhold Niebuhr was also a Christian theologian, a pastor, professor, and a prolific author, just like his brother. And he wrote a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. This is a Christian classic that we're going to tackle today. It's a big book, it's a thick book, but it is a classic. All right, so before we dive directly into the book, let's talk about this person, Reinhold Niebuhr. Again, he was Richard Niebuhr's brother. He was actually Richard's older brother. Reinhold was born in 1892. These were this family. They were a family of German immigrants in Missouri. Reinhold was educated at Eden Theological Seminary and also at Yale. And he taught for many years in New York at Union Theological Seminary. That's really where his claim to fame is. Reinhold Niebuhr taught ethics many years there at Union Theological Seminary. However, before he taught at the seminary level, he was a pastor. Reinhold Niebuhr started his pastoral career as a pastor in Detroit, and he was ministering there around the time that the Ford Company was getting really big, and Niebuhr was actually a major rival in Detroit to Henry Ford. Niebuhr really was standing up against kind of big business and some of the manipulative tactics on working class people in the automotive industry at that time. So Niebuhr was a young man, a young pastor, a young minister during all of that time of major growth and also major conflict in the city of Detroit. Niebuhr was also heavily influenced, at least initially in his life, in the first years of his adult life. He was heavily influenced by the idealistic, what is called the social gospel. Walter Rauschenbusch may be a name that you're familiar with. He was a major social gospeler, which that group tended to think that we have it in ourselves to make sure that the kingdom of God does come on earth as it is in heaven, and we need to do certain things and take care of certain activities, idealistic activities, and we can bring in a kind of utopia. But Niebuhr later in his life transitioned to becoming what's called a realist. He never really took on that term, but that's the term that's most readily identified with him. He became a Christian realist and sort of turned his back on this idealistic, utopian kind of thinking. He was a socialist, in fact, early on in his career, but really began to turn from that kind of thinking and that kind of rhetoric later in his life through very rigorous theological examination. Niebuhr was also politically active for many years, was a big influence on Martin Luther King Jr., and on the civil rights, kind of the flavor and the philosophy and the theology behind the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Perhaps, however, Niebuhr is known best for a little prayer that he wrote, and it went viral before that was even a cool thing to do. He wrote something called the Serenity Prayer. You may have heard this. Some groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and other groups about recovery use the Serenity Prayer. That prayer deeply reflects the theology and the practice of Reinhold Niebuhr. And I would highly encourage you, if you don't know about that prayer, just Google it and look it up. It's a wonderful, wonderful prayer for when things are going good in your life, and certainly for when things are going the wrong way for you. Niebuhr is very famous for that particular prayer. All right, so let's talk specifically then about this book, the Christian classic called Moral Man and Immoral Society. It was published in 1932. And if you can kind of wrap your head around some of the historical events around that time, uh, you'll come to find a level of understanding for what Niebuhr is talking about in this book that makes it very relevant for our day and time. So 1932, this kind of being enamored with idealism, and this is going to be a Christian century, the 20th century, and we're moving towards and progressing towards this utopian ideal in Christendom. By 1932, that was really going out the window. The idealism was now being tempered by this realism that, hey, we really are sinners in need of grace. World War I, the Great War, was fought and fortunately had ended, but there was great conflict that came out of that. And remember, the Niebuhr family had a German heritage. So Niebuhr was very attuned to the conflict that was going on in the interwar period of the 1920s and 30s in Germany. And he became very alarmed about the rise in National Socialism or the Nazi Party in Germany, and became actually a prophetic voice, along with people like Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It became a prophetic voice about the dangers that were lurking under the surface in Europe in the 1930s. So this was a groundbreaking work. There was still this air, however, in the culture, especially in the West, of, if we just are peaceable and we can all get along, and we're moving towards this great ideal and bringing in the kingdom of God. Niebuhr is saying, hey, let's tap the brakes on that kind of thinking. There's some things going on in our world today that idealism and humanism are just not going to fix. They are not going to fix the major problems that are on the horizon. Just look at Germany in 1932, 1933, and you can see kind of the writing on the wall. This thing is going to go south pretty quick. So that's the cultural milieu that Niebuhr is writing in here, in this work, his writing here. All right. It could be viewed then as a significant diatribe against theological liberalism or the social gospel movement. In other words, Niebuhr is coming out of that idealistic sort of flavored Christianity and saying, I don't know if this is the right path to go down. And some of the folks that he was really friends with and in that movement were sort of shocked by this, and were wondering, well, why is Niebuhr turning his back on us? It was viewed by some as an attack on them, and certainly a shift in Niebuhr's thinking. And he actually, in his career, went through a number of shifts that you can track through his books. Niebuhr was obviously impacted by the events in Germany. We just talked about that. The attempts to pacify Hitler, that was right on the horizon. And this thinking of, if we just give this evil dictator what he wants, then we're all just going to live happily ever after. Niebuhr would say, yeah, I don't think that's going to be the right way to go. And he does that from a theological level. The book was viewed quite favorably by Jews, obviously, who were being persecuted in Europe. Many Jews, the majority of Jews in this time, viewed this book as just an excellent way of viewing the world through a theological framework that could be understood and applied specifically in their persecuted people group. And then, really, the main thesis of the book is this. If we could sort of get everything in a nutshell, again, this is a major work, it's an academic work, it's hard to understand at some points, but the major thesis really is this, that moral behaviors, the way we act, behave morally, moral behaviors vary wildly between individuals and groups. In other words, we as individuals can think about morals and certain things in one way, but if we get in a group of people, all of that can be thrown out the window. And when we get into groups, the collective moral behavior, we can do things in groups that we would never do on our own. And there is this power within groups. And the only way, Niebuhr will argue, sometimes, not all the time, but most of the time, the way to dislodge this collective power, i.e. the Nazis, the way to dislodge that power is not simply through trying to appease that power, but sometimes power is going to have to be met with other power. And in an idealistic, humanistic age that Niebuhr was writing this in, that kind of thinking was very controversial. So he's coming from the viewpoint that sometimes groups get together and can act in extremely immoral ways and do things that we would never do individually. And these collective groups, once they get entrenched, can get a lot of power. So how do you dislodge these immoral collective groups? All right, that's the book in basically a nutshell. So let's go through chapter by chapter essentially and sort of break this down and get some of the highlights of the book and how Niebuhr gets at this idea of power and how we interact and behave around one another and what it means truly to live out an ethical life even when there's so many non-idealistic things happening around us. So Niebuhr comes right out of the gate in chapter 1 and says something that's pretty shocking. He says that human beings will never really be able to establish a truly just and equitable society. Now, that is shocking. And it's even shocking to hear in 2024 when I'm recording this video, because that's the rhetoric that we hear still today, right? This idea that, if we can just do X, Y, and Z, we will have a truly just society. If we can just bring in this ideal way of looking at things and convince people to come to our way of thinking, then we'll truly have justice and we'll truly be equal and we'll just live happily ever after. Niebuhr says that's not going to work. But why? I mean, that sounds really cynical and really skeptical. And why would a Christian pastor and a theologian say we can't do that? Well, if you look at the biblical narrative, especially looking at human nature, which, by the way, we'll talk about that in a subsequent video. Niebuhr also wrote a book about the nature of man, and it's called The Nature and Destiny of Man, where he goes into this in great detail. That we'll save that for another video. But he says the reason why we'll never be able as human beings to establish a truly just society is because we as human beings, we have good intentions. We have benevolent impulses. We want to get along, but We are very selfish people, aren't we? We're prideful people. This is the biblical story. We are fallen human beings. And yes, most of us, I would say, the vast majority of people around the world want to have a society that, yeah, the pendulum of justice is pretty equal. We all get along. We all, regardless of our nationality and background and race, we're able to work things out. But we are very selfish and prideful people, and that always gets in the way. We need something more, to depend on something and someone other than ourselves to create this ideal society. We can't do it on our own. Niebuhr also argues that coercion in social groups is inevitable. In other words, when we get a group of people together and say, you know what, we're going to bring in a just and equitable society, that's not going to work because inevitably in that group, the group dynamics, because we're selfish, sinful people, there's going to be coercion, there's going to be manipulation, and it's going to go off the rails, and we're going to need help with that. Also, Niebuhr says that frustrated individuals often become willing tools of political power groups. In other words, some groups, especially political groups, thrive on looking for these frustrated individuals and saying, hey, come be a part of our group. And they're not really seeing, these frustrated people are not really seen as human beings. They're seen as tools, as actors to satisfy the whims of the oligarchy, the people in power. Yikes. Okay, so what do we do with that? Wow, this Niebuhr is not painting a pretty picture. Do you see what he's saying here? We're never going to be able to get along as much as we want to. We cannot bring in a utopian society. Things are not going to go the way we want. We're sinful, we're selfish. We tend, when we get into groups, to coerce people to rally around our cause, and we use them as tools and we don't see them as human beings. Yikes, what do we do with this? Well, that gets us to chapter 2. So, some people say that, especially the religious people around us, this could be Christians, this could be Jewish people, Muslims, all sorts of religious groups. Many religious people would look at this and say, you know what, Niebuhr, I sort of agree with you that, there's something inherently wrong with us, especially when we get into groups. We have a tendency to coerce each other, and we really go off the rails, and we're not going to be able to bring in this just, equitable society that we're all longing for. So here's what we need to do. The religious folks would say the solution is to create a purer form of religion. So the religious idealist, as Niebuhr calls them, would say, hey, you know what? If we just do a better job at being good at our religious faith, if we can make a pure Christianity, a pure Jewishness, Judaism, a pure Islam, then that will help cure these ills that are deep down inside the human heart, and then that will pave the way for us to be just and equitable and all those things that we want. So there are some people who say it's a pure, better religion that's the cure. That's the cure-all. That's the medicine. That's what we need. So Niebuhr would say in chapter 2, listen, religious folks, I hear you. I hear your argument. But there's a problem with that. More on that in just a moment. He also talks about another group of people who are not really religious folks. These would be more what Niebuhr calls rationalists. They would say, if we use our rational thinking, our reason skills, then that's really the cure all to our problems. We need to develop a better education system. We need to look at the gifts and the talents of people and help them to hone their true potentialities. And that's going to be the cure-all. Now, let me say something here so we don't sound so cynical and so skeptical. Niebuhr is not here saying that we need to discard religion and that we need to discard good, reasonable thinking and education and all of that. He is not saying that at all. If we're Christian or Jewish or Muslim, of course, let's be faithful and let's for sure do do a better job at cultivating our faith. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And also for the rationalist among us, absolutely, we need to do a better job at education and developing ourselves. There's nothing wrong with that. However, Niebuhr says there is a problem to making these kinds of things the cure all, the end all to solving society's problems. He says, and he gives us the reasons why. Here's the problems with this way of thinking. First of all, our pride or our sin is always going to get in the way. That clouds our thinking. And remember, Niebuhr is coming from this uh, Jewish, Christian, biblical, historical theology here, saying, listen, we know from the biblical story, the narrative, it is that we have all sinned and come short of the glory of God. And we have this hubris in us. We are from the very beginning with Adam and Eve in taking the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was the human attempt to escape the bounds of our human finitude and to become gods and to try to take on what only belongs to God, to escape the boundaries. And so that kind of thinking is always going to cloud our judgment and our thinking to where this reasonable thinking is never really going to get to a point where we escape our hubris. Ugh, okay. Another problem is this. This is an actual quote from the book. Niebuhr says, the force of the egoistic impulse is much more powerful than we realize. In other words, this is like what Paul said when he said, I find that there is a law at work in my bones and in my flesh that's really opposite and different than the law of love, the law of the spirit. In other words, there's this flesh, there's this egoistic impulse, there is something in me that is always butting heads with the things of God. And our tendency is to say, you know what, if I can get myself to a certain level, then I will just escape all of that and I will overcome my egoistic impulse. Nobody ever really conquers that on this side of the grave, right? We in Jesus die to our flesh, but man, every day we're having to kill it more and more, aren't we? And Niebuhr is saying, remember, you don't take yourself so seriously that you think that you've totally escaped the bonds of your egoistic impulse. That is always going to be there. So these cure-alls of religion and rationalism, humanism and idealism, there's always going to be a tinge of pride and ego in here that we're going to have to deal with. And the third problem, he says, is that our sense of progress in terms of technology and education is not keeping up with social problems. Wow, isn't that prophetic? And remember, he's writing this in the early 1930s. I mean, talk about technology and education today. You know, if somebody today in 2024 is looking back at 1932, they're saying, hey, we've made great progress in technology and education since 1932. But I think we can reasonably agree that even all of that progress is still not keeping up with the problems that we have. In fact, some of the technology and education and all the progress has created more problems. All right. So, in chapter 2, Niebuhr is telling us these are the answers that our society is giving us to these problems. More religion, more rationality. But man, we're not escaping the pride, the ego, and all this progress is just creating more problems. So what do we do with that? Well, on to chapter 3. Okay, Niebuhr now begins to talk about not necessarily solutions, but he begins to work the problem a little bit more here. Chapter 3, he talks more to religious people here than he does the rational people. What can religious people do? Well, one of his guiding teachings towards this end is to say we need to be aware or beware of what he calls asceticism and mysticism. Now, what are those things? All right, well, asceticism is this idea of kind of like we talked about in the last video about Christ um, against culture. What his brother would say is Christ against culture. We've got to be aware of that, this withdrawal, throwing our hands up and saying, there's nothing we can do about this, so we might as well just withdraw into a commune and disassociate ourselves totally from the world and kind of hole ourselves up. That's asceticism. It's a mystical way of thinking. It's as Niebuhr would say, it's a drawing into the self. And he says that can be very, very dangerous because in in the name of getting rid of the self, mysticism says get rid of the self, but the irony is that in trying to do that, you draw more inward. That's not going to fix the problem. Withdrawal, retreating into myself to lose myself, this kind of mystical thinking, Niebuhr says that's not going to work. So beware of that. Don't withdraw. Be a part of what's going on in the society around you. Work the problem. Be engaged. Don't just throw your hands up. Also, next he says that we need to be aware of the ideal. So on the opposite side of the spectrum, this ideal of developing a superior holiness. He says that is unattainable and often can lead to religious fanaticism. So what he's telling us here is beware of the opposite side of that coin of withdrawal, retreat, asceticism, mysticism. The opposite side of that is what his brother would call Christ above culture. This idea that, well, I'm just going to escape it all. By getting above it, I'll be engaged, but I will develop a superior holiness. And that will solve the problems and we'll have more equity and justice for all. No, that Niebuhr says that is not going to work. When you try to develop a superior holiness, a superior religion, first of all, you're never going to attain that. That's impossible. Second, it's going to lead you to becoming fanatical in your religion, and that's not going to do anybody any good. Thirdly, Niebuhr says merely demanding that people submit to Christ is unrealistic. So again, he's kind of working the angles of this problem. So what can religious people do? Beware of asceticism. We can't go the way of retreat, withdrawal. Beware of trying to develop this superior holiness. That's not going to work either. But then, what if we say, well, what if we just go out there and demand people come to Christ? Niebuhr says that's unrealistic. In fact, that may be too simplistic. Going into a complex problem with complex issues and saying, you know what, you people just need to come to Jesus and you'll figure it all out. Niebuhr says that's unrealistic. We need to come to the table and say, hey, listen, let's all repent and follow Jesus Christ. Absolutely, we need to be evangelistic. No problem with that at all. Niebuhr's not saying we need to abandon that or jettison evangelism. No, he's not saying that at all. He's just saying it's unrealistic to come into some of these complex situations and say, you know what, God said it, Jesus did it, I believe it, that ends it. No, that's unrealistic. We've got to see what God is actually doing around us and then work the problems, sometimes in very complex problems, by prayerful engagement. And then fourth, Niebuhr says, beware of sentimentality. This is Niebuhr's way of saying this idealism of, everything's just going to work out fine. Don't worry about it. Don't worry, be happy. This kind of unrealistic sentimentality. Niebuhr says the Great War squashed this. We had and he's bearing personal testimony here from this. He came from this perspective of, what? Let's just all hold hands and get together and sing the Coca-Cola song, and everything's going to work out. But then he's looking at Nazism and the rise of fascism, and he's looking at all this and saying, you know what? Holding hands and singing Kumbaya, that ain't going to fix this. All right. So beware of that. But also, Niebuhr says, beware of defeatism. This idea of, man, I can't fix anything. I can't contribute anything. All these people, the world is too far gone. It's gone to nowhere in a handbasket. So I'm just moving on and forget all these people. Everybody's just a hypocrite anyway. That's a kind of defeatism that will not seriously engage the problem. So to kind of review here in chapter 3, what can we as religious people do? Don't withdraw and just lean into yourself, trying to discover yourself or get rid of yourself, because that's not going to work. Trying to develop this superiority of your holiness, that's not going to work either. Just going into a situation and saying, you know what, you all have got it all wrong. This complex situation is not as complicated as you think. You just need Jesus, and that's going to settle it all. Jesus is the answer for the world today, and that's it. That's too unrealistic. And then also beware of sentimentality, this idea of don't worry, be happy, Jesus is my homeboy. And also this idea of defeatism, that I'm just going to throw my hands up and give up. That's not the way to go either. All right, so that gets us to chapter 4. And he now gets into how we can engage in the world around us in all of these complicated problems. What do we do as, especially as Christians? How do we become engaged when it seems so complicated and nothing really works right, and there's always this egotistical impulse, and we're always fighting against the flesh, and what do we do? What do we do? Okay. Well, Niebuhr comes at this by suggesting that it is okay to become politically active. And that's a major factor, actually, of this book that may cause some Christians to sort of sit up straight or even strafe a little bit and say, you know what, I don't want to be politically active. I don't want to engage in that kind of thing at all. Niebuhr would say we probably are going to have to do that in order to make any sort of progress in the goals that we are shooting for, to have justice and a more equitable society. We're going to have to get involved some way. All right, so how do you do that? Well, again, Niebuhr approaches this by telling us more about what not to do. And he says, beware of considering yourself more noble or more intelligent than the ignorant patriots out there. In other words, there's some of us, and we still see this behavior today. Again, we're filming this in 2024, and there's a major election about to happen that hasn't happened yet when I'm filming this video. And so we really don't know the outcome of the election yet. But there is this tendency, especially in divisive election years like this, for people, especially people of faith, to say, you know what, those people who are engaged, especially in politics and all of that craziness, they are just ignorant and beneath me. And I'm kind of this more noble, intelligent. I come from that perspective. And so I'm not really going to engage in that low life behavior. Niebuhr says, beware of that kind of that kind of thinking. It's okay to be active. It's okay to engage. And as Christians, especially, we probably need to be more engaged in the political process and even holding public office. Niebuhr would not shy away from saying to Christians, we need to be engaged, but we need to be aware of the ways that we do that. Perfect example of that, Martin Luther King Jr., very politically active. But how did he come at it? From a nonviolent way. He didn't come at it by saying, I'm smarter than all you people. I have all the answers. You all are just beneath me. Follow me. I have it all figured out. I am the way to solve this problem. No, he said there is a way to engage, and this is how we do that through nonviolent action. Made all the difference in the world. Niebuhr also says that the will of people, be very aware of this, the will of the people is driven largely, now not all the time, but largely the will of people is driven by self-interest of the dominant groups in a nation. People may become more loyal, it says loyalty, people may become more loyal to these interests than to the nations. All right, so what does that mean? He's saying, all right, if you choose to get engaged in the dirt and in the messiness of everyday life alongside people and groups, especially political groups, you have to remember something, that the people who are at the top, the people who are prominent, the people who are directing things, the popular folks, oftentimes their self-interests become so intermixed with the what they call the interests of the nation, right? That it's hard to tell one from the other. And so this is Niebuhr's way of saying we've got to be really discerning, because there are some folks who are at the top of their game, right, in leadership, especially in political leadership. But Niebuhr is saying it's going to be hard to decipher what's in the best interest of the people alongside what this guy is really, or gal is interested in for themselves. Sometimes they're mixing those two things together. So their self-interests are mixing in with what they're calling the interest of the greater good. All right, and we got to be aware of that. So if we're going to get our hands dirty in being involved in the minutia and the complexity of trying to get along and trying to develop a loving, just society, we've got to know that. And sometimes it's easy for us to be fooled by a leader or a group of leaders in our country or society or nation or even our world. It's easy to be fooled because they're going to tell us this is for the greater good, but we have to say, is it really, or are you just imposing your self-interest on all the rest of us? Woo, that's a tough topic. And then also, Niebuhr says, be careful of endowing a nation with the aura of the sacred. In other words, be very, very careful. And again, he's writing this in a time where Nazism is really on the rise in Germany. Fascism in Italy is just exploding all over the world. You have communism nearly at its peak under Stalin's rule. And my goodness, what is happening in the world? Niebuhr is saying, listen, there is this tendency that we have to say, listen, my people group, my society, my culture, my nation is the true holy people of God. We are sacred. We are endowed by God Himself with it is our birthright, our sacred birthright to rule and to reign and to enlarge our territory. Niebuhr says if we're going to get active and involved in the way that these things work in the world, holy moly, be careful of that. We only have one God. His brother would say, H. Richard Niebuhr would say, this is an issue where we have to be radically monotheistic. All right, let's keep going then. We have just a couple more chapters here. So chapter 5 in the book Niebuhr talks about, all right, there's so many complicated, complex divisions among us and in our people groups and in our nations. What do we do with that? Well, he says, first of all, idealism, if we just go into situations with rose-colored glasses on, he says that's going to tend to, not all the time, but is going to tend to, idealism tends to confuse issues more than it clarifies. Rose-colored glasses doesn't really do anything about the real issues that we face. So we've got to go in with an open mind to things, but also saying, listen, there's a lot of complexity here that we may not be able to solve with just, bumper sticker slogans. Then he also says injustices in a society, and this is a quote, will not be abolished purely by moral suasion. Now, this was a very controversial line in this book because up until this point, and even a little bit afterwards, Niebuhr was definitely a pacifist. Let's not go to war. Let's not even open the door to that. But he looks around and sees what's happening in Germany and in Italy and the wider scope of Europe and in the Soviet Union. And he is saying, I don't know if just talking to people and trying to persuade them to a peaceful, just, equitable resolution is going to work. And so he cracks the door open just a little bit here to say, you know what, power sometimes is going to have to be met by power. And my goodness, this opens the door to a very complicated theological and political argument that still to this day hasn't even been settled. You have people on one side of the issue who say that there is a way to justify aggression and violence and war. And then on the pacifist side, I can also understand that part of the argument where Jesus clearly says we've got to love our enemies and pray for them. And if someone hits you across the side of the face, you turn the other cheek. And so, how does that work, however, when you have your Hitlers who are blaming all the world's problems on the Jews and saying, the final solution to this problem is just to exterminate them? And he goes on to kill 6 million Jews. What do you do with that? Do you just say, well, let's pray for Hitler, and meanwhile he's killing all these people? So here Niebuhr is beginning to open the door, crack the window just a little bit, and saying, this is more complicated than we give it credit for. What do we do with this? All right, the next chapter, chapter 6, he says, again, he opens this door a little bit more. He says, there are times when only power can dislodge power. But man, we got to be careful with that. Why? Because we're human beings. And this could go south really, really quickly. For instance, he reminds us that vengeance, in other words, if we want to solve conflict just through vengeance, my way or the highway, he says that is going to destroy any chance for cooperation down the road. And vengeance only depends on coercion. So if we're out to get even with someone because of a wrong or even a perceived wrong, that is never, never, never going to work. And then, for instance, he gives a for instance here. He comes out pretty heavily here against Marxism. And he sort of labels Marxism as a vengeful philosophy, a vengeful way of thinking. He says in Christianity, the Christian way of thinking, the weak are made strong by God's power. In other words, we're not going to take vengeance on our enemies who have squashed us or oppressed us. Okay, we're made strong in the power of God. The weak are made strong by the cross, by the blood of Christ, not through some sort of coercive tactic, revolution, violence, that sort of thing. But he says in Marxism, the weak are made strong by economic power. In other words, how can we coerce economic power and coerce the engine through through our rhetoric, and eventually Lenin and Stalin would take this to the next level. They would put Marxism on steroids and use violent revolution to overthrow and bring in, utopia for the proletariat, right? Let's get rid of these stupid bourgeois people. They have oppressed us for so long that we're going to take our vengeance on them. Niebuhr would say that's never going to work. That is just never going to work. And I think that's prophetic because as we've seen history play out in the 20th and early 21st century, we've seen that where this kind of vengeful sort of thinking, Marxist kind of thinking has been applied, that there really is no hope for good cooperation that comes out of that. And so how then can we get at the problem of injustice? How can we eliminate injustice by abolishing what is evil in a society and without destroying what's preserved in it? And that's the crux, man. That is the real question. And that's sort of the sum of the book right there. So that Niebuhr says we're going to have these people just butting heads all the time. We cannot get away from that because of human pride and sin and egotism and selfishness. We can't do that. So we need to be engaged. How do we do that? How do we eliminate injustice? How do we develop a more equitable society? How do we get along? How do we bring in the kingdom of God? How do we make disciples and obey what Jesus has called us to do? By absolutely taking out what is evil in this world. Let's throw that out. We need to take out what's evil. But how do we do that without destroying everything in our wake? That's the bottom line here. We got to be careful. And then lastly for today, Niebuhr gives us some really good quotes in chapter 7 of this book. He says that, and I love this one, the realm of politics is a twilight zone. Amen, brother, to that. In 2024, when we're making this video, that is as timely of a statement as one can make. We're going to have to be engaged. But man, it's a twilight zone. He says there are times then that when violence can't be ruled out if it deters others from murder. So again, he's cracking this door open just a little bit and sort of fooling around with being uncomfortable with pacifism. And he says, I think I will advocate just a little bit for just war as long as it deters others from murder, from greater sin. For instance, how do we dislodge a guy like Hitler? Sometimes that is going to take force to do something like that. We've got to dislodge what's evil, but we can't just burn all of our bridges along the way. This is a twilight zone. We've got to figure out how to work in this kind of environment. Then he goes on to say every society needs methods for arbitrating conflict. In other words, every time we have a conflict, we can't say, well, I'm just going to dislodge your power with my power. And we all get violent. That, of course, leads nowhere. So what are the ways that what are the rules of engagement here? How do we arbitrate the conflict we have between us? And then finally in the book, he says, beware of vagary. What he means by that is we've got to get really specific about how we're going to solve our problems. Again, Martin Luther King Jr., a great example here. He didn't come out and say, hey, let's just get together and everybody get along and let's do better and bring in a better world. No, he said, how we're going to do this is through nonviolence. We're going to have the church involved here. I have a dream. Not about color of skin, but the content of character. My goodness, that is not vague at all. This is very specific. People know where you stand, and that's how you begin to engage in a more just society. All right, so that is a classic, y'all. Moral man and an immoral society. And it's designed to make us uncomfortable. It's designed to make us think. Niebuhr saying, don't retreat, don't try to get above it all, don't just wave your hands goodbye and say, I'm out of here, but engage. But there are ways of doing that where you don't get caught up in this idea of vengeance or egotism that will just ruin everything. All right, so next time we get together, we're probably going to tackle another book from Reinhold Niebuhr. But until then, hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend, great night whenever you're watching this, and we'll see you again soon. All right, bye-bye, everybody.